The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Harrison as Sarah Chun stepped off the transport bus, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slight frame that made her look even younger than her years. The other recruits getting off the bus towered over her, their muscular builds and confident swagger making her feel like a child who had wandered into the wrong place. "Is this some kind of joke?" muttered Jake Morrison, a former college football player whose neck was thicker than Sarah's waist. He glanced at Sarah with barely concealed amusement. Did they start accepting high school students now? The comment drew snickers from several nearby recruits. Marcus Rodriguez, a former gang member from Los Angeles who had joined the Army to turn his life around, shook his head. "Man, basic training is going to eat her alive. She looks like she couldn't lift my boot, let alone a rifle." Sarah kept her eyes forward, her jaw set in determination. She had heard variations of these comments her entire life. Growing up as the smallest kid in every class, the daughter of immigrant parents who ran a small restaurant in Chinatown, she had learned early that people would always underestimate her. But she had also learned something else. Underestimation could be her greatest advantage. The drill sergeant's voice boomed across the courtyard like thunder. "Listen up, maggots. I'm Drill Sergeant Williams, and for the next 16 weeks, your sorry lives belong to me." His eyes swept across the group of 43 new recruits, lingering for a moment on Sarah with what might have been skepticism. "You think you're tough? You think you've got what it takes to be a soldier? We'll see about that." The first week was exactly as brutal as Sarah had expected. The physical training pushed everyone to their limits, but it seemed to push her beyond them. During the morning runs, she fell behind the pack, her short legs struggling to match the pace set by her taller squaw mates. The weight of her equipment felt crushing during field exercises, and her bunkmates had to help her lift her gear into the overhead storage. "Chun, what are you doing back there?" Drill Sergeant Williams barked during a particularly grueling obstacle course run. "My grandmother moves faster than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. The comment triggered another round of snickering from her fellow recruits. Tommy Parker, a farm boy from Iowa with arms like tree trunks, leaned over to his bunkmate. $20 says she washes out before week 3. There's no way someone that small can handle real combat training. "You're on," replied David Kowalski, a former factory worker from Detroit. "Though honestly, I'm surprised she made it past the physical fitness test to get here in the first place." What they didn't know was that Sarah had been preparing for this moment her entire life. While other kids were watching television or playing video games, she had been practicing martial arts under the guidance of her grandfather, a former Chinese military officer who had immigrated to America after the Korean War. He had taught her that size meant nothing if you understood leverage, timing, and strategy. "The strongest tree breaks in the storm," he would tell her in his accented English, "but the bamboo bends and survives. Be bamboo, little one." During hand-to-hand combat training, Sarah began to show glimpses of what she was capable of. When paired with Jake Morrison for grappling practice, everyone expected to see her get tossed around like a rag doll. Instead, she used his size against him, dropping low and using his momentum to send him sprawling to the mat. "Lucky shot," Jake grumbled, his face red with embarrassment as the other recruits laughed. But it wasn't luck, and Sarah proved it by putting him down twice more in quick succession. Her movements were precise and economical, wasting no energy on flashy techniques. She fought like someone who had studied every possible disadvantage and learned to turn them into strengths. Still, hand-to-hand combat was only a small part of their training. The real test came during weapons training, tactical exercises, and leadership challenges. Sarah's accuracy with a rifle was above average, but nothing spectacular. Her tactical knowledge was solid, but unremarkable. What began to set her apart was her ability to observe and adapt. While other recruits focused on proving their individual strength, Sarah watched how the group dynamics played out. She noticed that Jake, despite his physical prowess, became frustrated and sloppy when things didn't go his way. Marcus was tough and street smart, but He had trouble following orders from authority figures. Tommy was strong and willing, but he lacked confidence in high-pressure situations. Most importantly, she noticed that their squad was struggling with cohesion. Everyone was so focused on proving themselves individually that they weren't working effectively as a team. Their performance in group exercises was mediocre at best, despite having some of the most physically capable recruits in the entire company. The turning point came during week 4, during a night navigation exercise in the woods surrounding the base. The squad was given a series of coordinates to reach using only a compass and map, with a strict time limit that would determine whether they passed or failed the exercise as a group. Jake had immediately appointed himself as the unofficial leader, his loud voice and imposing presence making it seem natural. "All right, everyone follow me," he announced, barely glancing at the map before striking off into the darkness. "I've done plenty of hunting. I know these woods." But Jake's confidence was misplaced. Within an hour, it became clear that they were lost. The coordinates he was following would have taken them in completely the wrong direction, and his stubborn refusal to admit his mistake was making things worse by the minute. "We need to backtrack," Marcus suggested, frustration evident in his voice. "We're going in circles, man." "I know what I'm doing," Jake snapped back. "Just because you grew up in the city doesn't mean you know anything about navigation." The argument that followed was heated and unproductive. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown, and precious time was wasted while they stood in a circle arguing about whose fault it was that they were lost. Sarah watched from the edge of the group, saying nothing but taking careful note of their position and the mistakes that had led them here. Finally, Tommy Parker spoke up. "Hey, what if we asked Jen? She's been really quiet, but she might have some ideas." The suggestion was met with skeptical looks. "What's she gonna do?" Jake scoffed. "She can barely keep up on the morning runs. You think she knows anything about land navigation?" "Actually," Sarah said quietly, stepping forward with a map and compass in her hands, "I think I know where we are." She had been tracking their movement from the beginning, using techniques her grandfather had taught her about maintaining situational awareness, even when following someone else's lead. Jake laughed outright. "Oh, this should be good. The girl who needs help lifting her pack thinks she can get us unlost." Sarah ignored the mockery and spread the map on the ground, using a small flashlight to illuminate it. "We started here," she said, pointing to their initial position. "Jake led us northeast for about 45 minutes, which should have put us around here." Her finger traced their approximate path on the map. "But I think we actually went more east than northeast, which would put us closer to here." She looked up at the canopy above them, identifying the North Star through a gap in the trees. "If I'm right, the next checkpoint should be about a kilometer southwest of our current position, not northwest like Jake was planning." Marcus leaned in to look at the map. "How can you be sure?" "I've been counting steps and tracking time since we started," Sarah replied. "Plus, we crossed that creek about 20 minutes ago, and there's only one creek in this section of the map that runs in the direction we crossed it." Jake shook his head dismissively. "That's a lot of guesswork. I say we stick with the original plan." "Then we'll fail the exercise," Sarah said simply. "We only have 2 hours left, and if we keep going northwest, we'll run out of time before we even get close to the right area." The squad faced a crucial decision. They could follow Jake's lead and likely fail the exercise, or they could trust Sarah's analysis and potentially succeed. The choice revealed something important about each of them. Tommy was the first to speak. "I think we should try Sarah's way. What we're doing isn't working." David nodded in agreement. "She's been right about the small stuff so far. Maybe she's right about this too." One by one, the other squad members voiced their support for trying Sarah's navigation plan. Even Marcus, who had initially been skeptical of taking orders from anyone, admitted that her analysis made sense. Jake found himself isolated, his leadership undermined by his own stubborn refusal to consider alternatives. "Fine," he said finally, "but when this goes wrong, don't come crying to me." Sarah took point, leading the squad through the dense forest with quiet confidence. She moved differently than Jake had, pausing frequently to check their bearing and consulting the map regularly instead of charging ahead blindly. Her pace was steady, but not rushed, and she took the time to ensure everyone was keeping up. "How do you know all this stuff?" Tommy asked during one of their brief stops. "My grandfather taught me," Sarah replied. "He used to take me camping when I was little, and he showed me how to read the land. He said that understanding your environment was more important than being strong or fast." As they moved through the forest, something interesting began to happen. The squad's dynamics started to shift. Instead of the chaotic, ego-driven group that had been arguing earlier, they began to function as an actual team. Sarah's calm leadership style brought out the best in each of them. She asked Marcus to take point during the trickier sections, recognizing his street-smart ability to spot potential dangers. She had Tommy help navigate the steeper terrain, using his farm boy strength to assist the smaller members of the squad. Even David, who had been quiet and withdrawn, found himself taking on a more active role as Sarah encouraged him to share his observations about their surroundings. Most surprisingly, Jake began to come around. His initial resentment at being superseded gradually gave way to grudging respect as Sarah proved that she knew what she was doing. When they encountered a particularly challenging obstacle, a steep ravine that needed to be crossed, she didn't try to handle it herself. Instead, she asked Jake to help figure out the best way to get everyone across safely. "You're stronger than me," she told him matter-of-factly. "I can plan the route, but I'll need your help to execute it." The acknowledgement of his strengths, combined with the recognition of her planning abilities, created a partnership that worked far better than either of them could have managed alone. Jake's physical capabilities, guided by Sarah's strategic thinking, allowed them to overcome obstacles that would have stopped them if they had continued working at cross purposes. They reached the first checkpoint with time to spare, and Sarah's navigation proved to be accurate. The coordinates she had calculated led them exactly where they needed to be. But more than that, the squad was now functioning as a cohesive unit for the first time since their training had begun. "Damn, Chen," Marcus said as they located the checkpoint marker. "I owe you an apology. You really know your stuff." The remaining checkpoints fell quickly as the squad worked together with newfound efficiency. Sarah continued to navigate, but now she had the full support and cooperation of her squad mates. They reached the final objective with 45 minutes to spare, making them one of the fastest squads to complete the exercise. When they returned to base, Drill Sergeant Williams was waiting for them with what might have been the hint of a smile on his usually stern face. Well, he said, "Look what we have here." The misfits actually managed to pull it together. He looked directly at Sarah. "Chun, who was running navigation for your squad?" "I was Drill Sergeant," Sarah replied. "And Morrison, who was your squad leader when you started the exercise?" Jake straightened up. "I was Drill Sergeant." "Interesting. And yet Chun was the one doing the navigation. Did you step down from leadership, Morrison?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake could have claimed that he was still in charge, that Sarah was just following his orders. It would have been the easy way to protect his ego and maintain the fiction that size and loudness equated to leadership ability. Instead, he surprised everyone, including himself. "No, Drill Sergeant. Chin took over because she was better at it than me. She got us through the exercise." Williams nodded slowly. "That's an interesting development. We'll see how that plays out in future exercises." As they headed back to the barracks that night, the atmosphere in the squad had changed completely. The mocking comments and dismissive attitudes that had characterized Sarah's first month of training were replaced by genuine respect and curiosity. Her bunkmates wanted to know more about her background, her training methods, and her thoughts on upcoming challenges. "So what's your story, Chun?" David asked as they cleaned their equipment. "Where did you learn to do all that navigation stuff?" Sarah smiled, thinking of her grandfather and the countless hours they had spent in the mountains outside San Francisco, learning to read the land and understand the principles of strategy and leadership. "My grandfather always told me that the best leaders aren't the ones who shout the loudest or hit the hardest. They're the ones who see what others miss and help everyone succeed together." She looked around at her squad mates, seeing them not as obstacles to overcome, but as assets to utilize. Each of them had strengths that could be leveraged, weaknesses that could be compensated for, and potential that could be unlocked with the right approach. He also told me that respect isn't something you demand, she continued. It's something you earn by proving you're worthy of it. As the weeks that followed would prove, Sarah was just getting started. The navigation exercise had been a glimpse of her potential, but it was only the beginning of her transformation from the mocked recruit who couldn't keep up on morning runs to something far more dangerous. A leader who understood that true strength came not from physical dominance, but from the ability to bring out the best in everyone around her. The other squads in their company began to take notice. Drill Sergeant Williams started paying closer attention to their performance. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah began to realize that she might have found her calling in a way she had never expected. But first, she had to survive the rest of basic training. And as she was about to discover, the real challenges were just beginning. The success of the night navigation exercise marked a turning point for Sarah's squad, but it also attracted unwanted attention from other groups within the company. Word spread quickly through the barracks that the weak link squad had somehow managed to post one of the best times in the exercise, and not everyone was happy about it. "I heard Chin got lucky with a guess," sneered Brett Davidson, the informal leader of Alpha Squad, the group that had previously dominated most training exercises. Brett was everything that Jake Morrison had tried to be: tall, muscular, loud, and convinced of his own superiority. There's no way someone that small actually knows anything about real military tactics. Brett's squad had finished the navigation exercise third out of 8 squads, a result that wounded his pride considerably. He had been expecting to continue his streak of first-place finishes, and the fact that Sarah's previously struggling squad had beaten him was an insult he couldn't let stand. The opportunity for revenge came during week 6, when the company began urban warfare training. This exercise would test not only physical capabilities, but also tactical thinking, team coordination, and leadership under pressure. The scenario was complex. Squads would take turns attacking and defending a mock urban environment, with points awarded based on objectives completed, casualties minimized, and overall tactical effectiveness. Sarah's squad drew the defending assignment first, which meant they would have to hold a multi-building complex against an attacking force twice their size. The defenders would be armed with paintball weapons and have limited ammunition, while the attackers would have numerical superiority and better equipment. "This should be interesting," Drill Sergeant Williams commented as he briefed the exercise parameters. "The attacking force will be a combined squad led by Davidson. The defending force will be led by—" He paused, looking directly at Sarah's squad. "Who's running point for you people?" Jake stepped forward automatically, then stopped and looked back at Sarah. The moment stretched for several seconds as the rest of the company watched with interest. Finally, Jake spoke. "Chun is our tactical leader, Drill Sergeant." A murmur went through the assembled recruits. It was one thing for Sarah to help with navigation in the woods. It was quite another for her to be openly acknowledged as the tactical leader of her squad in a combat scenario. Brett Davidson laughed openly. "Oh, this is going to be fun. I can't wait to see how the little girl handles real pressure." Sarah said nothing, but her mind was already working through the problem. She had spent the previous evening studying the mock urban environment, memorizing the layout of buildings, identifying potential choke points, and defensive positions. More importantly, she had been observing the other squads during their training exercises, learning their preferred tactics, and identifying their weaknesses. Brett Davidson's leadership style was aggressive and direct. He favored overwhelming force and frontal assaults, using his squad's physical advantages to simply overpower opposition. It was an effective approach against most opponents, but Sarah suspected it might also be predictable. The mock urban environment consisted of 5 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, connected by narrow alleys and open spaces. The defending force's objective was to prevent the attackers from reaching and securing the central command post, located in the largest building. The attackers had 45 minutes to complete their mission. As Sarah's squad took their positions, She gathered them for a quick briefing. Brett's going to try to overwhelm us with a direct assault, she said quietly. He's got 16 people, we've got 8. If we try to match him strength for strength, we'll lose. So what do we do? Tommy asked. His confidence in Sarah had grown considerably since the navigation exercise, but the odds they were facing seemed impossible. We use their numbers against them, Sarah replied. A large group moves slowly and makes noise. They'll have trouble coordinating, especially in tight spaces. We're going to split up, use the buildings to break up their formation, and force them to fight us on our terms. She pointed to the map of the complex. Jake, take Marcus and David. I want you to set up in Building 3 here. Make noise, draw their attention, then fall back through this alley to Building 1. Make them think that's where our main force is positioned. What about the command post? Marcus asked. Aren't we supposed to be defending it? We are defending it, Sarah said. But we're not going to do it by sitting there waiting for them to come get us. Tommy, you and Lisa take position in Building 5 with Overwatch on the courtyard. Don't engage unless they try to cross the open space. She turned to the remaining 2 members of their squad. Rodriguez, you're with me. We're going to be in Building 4, but we're not staying there. Once Brett commits his forces to the main assault, we're going to circle around behind them and hit them from an unexpected angle. The plan was risky and relied heavily on timing and coordination. If any element failed to execute properly, the entire defense would collapse. But Sarah had observed something important about Brett's personality during previous exercises. He was impatient and ego-driven. If presented with what appeared to be a straightforward opportunity, he would take it without considering alternatives. The exercise began with Sarah's squad moving quickly into position. Jake's team made themselves conspicuous in Building 3, deliberately allowing themselves to be spotted as they set up their defensive positions. Tommy and Lisa disappeared into Building 5, using the rooftop access to establish Overwatch positions with clear fields of fire across the courtyard. Sarah and Rodriguez moved through the shadows to Building 4, which appeared to be empty and undefended. This was intentional. Sarah wanted Brett to believe that she had made a tactical error by failing to cover one of the key buildings. Brett's assault began exactly as Sarah had predicted. His combined squad moved as a single large group, approaching Building 3 with overwhelming force. The narrow alleys and confined spaces that Sarah had identified as disadvantages for a large group immediately began to work against them. Contact front, Jake shouted as Brett's advanced scouts spotted his defensive position, taking fire from Building 3. Brett's response was immediate and predictable. Alpha Team, flank left through the alley. Bravo Team, suppress that position. We're going in hard and fast. But the narrow alley that Brett chose for his flanking maneuver was exactly where Sarah had expected him to go. As his lead elements moved through the confined space, Jake's team executed a fighting withdrawal, falling back toward Building 1 while keeping up a steady rate of fire that forced the attackers to move cautiously. The maneuver split Brett's force in half, with one group pursuing Jake through the alleys while the other maintained pressure on Building 3. The coordination between the two groups immediately began to break down as they lost visual contact with each other. "Where's Alpha Team?" Brett shouted into his radio. "I need them to secure the left flank." "Still in the alley," came the reply. "These guys are putting up more of a fight than expected." That was Sarah's cue. While Brett was focused on coordinating his attack on Jake's position, she and Rodriguez slipped out of Building 4 and began moving through the shadows toward the attacker's rear. The large group that Brett had assembled created enough noise and distraction to mask their movement completely. Tommy's voice crackled over the radio. "2, this is Overwatch. I've got eyes on a group of 6 trying to cross the courtyard toward the command post. Looks like they're trying to bypass the main fight." "Roger, Overwatch. Take them," Sarah whispered back. The paintball rounds from Tommy and Lisa's position caught the flanking group completely by surprise. The elevated position gave them perfect fields of fire across the open courtyard, and the 6 attackers found themselves pinned down with no cover and no way to advance. But The real surprise came when Sarah and Rodriguez opened fire from behind Brett's main force. The attackers suddenly found themselves caught between multiple positions, taking fire from directions they hadn't even considered. "Contact rear," someone shouted. "How did they get behind us?" Brett's carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos as his squads tried to respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The large group that had been his main advantage became a liability as confusion spread through the ranks and friendly fire incidents began to occur. "Fall back to Rally Point Alpha," Brett ordered, but his forces were scattered across the complex and couldn't disengage cleanly. Every time one group tried to withdraw, they found themselves under fire from another unexpected position. The exercise ended with Brett's forces having failed to reach the command post and having suffered heavy casualties in the process. Sarah's squad had not only successfully defended their objective, but had done so while taking minimal losses themselves. "Time!" Drill Sergeant Williams called out. Exercise complete. All participants returned to the assembly area for debrief. As the two squads gathered in the courtyard, the atmosphere was tense. Brett's face was red with embarrassment and anger, while his squad mates looked frustrated and confused. They had expected an easy victory against a smaller, weaker opponent, and instead, they had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. "Davidson," Williams said, "what went wrong out there?" Brett struggled to find an explanation that didn't make him look incompetent. "They got lucky," Drill Sergeant. "Used some kind of unconventional tactics that wouldn't work in a real combat situation." Williams raised an eyebrow. "Unconventional tactics? You mean like using superior positioning, coordinated movement, and exploiting your enemy's weaknesses? Those are basic military principles, Davidson." The drill sergeant turned to Sarah. "Chun, walk me through your defensive plan." Sarah stood at attention and began explaining her tactical reasoning, pointing out how she had identified the attackers' likely approach routes, anticipated their tactical preferences, and positioned her forces to maximize their effectiveness against a numerically superior opponent. As she spoke, it became clear to everyone present that what had happened was not luck or unconventional tactics, but rather a carefully planned and flawlessly executed defensive strategy. Sarah had outthought Brett at every turn, using his own strengths against him and exploiting weaknesses he didn't even know he had. "Outstanding tactical thinking," Williams concluded. "Chun, your squad just demonstrated that superior strategy can overcome superior numbers when properly executed." Brett couldn't contain himself any longer. "With respect, Drill Sergeant, this was just one exercise under artificial conditions. In real combat, size and strength matter. You can't overcome basic physical limitations with clever tactics." Williams looked at Brett for a long moment. "Is that so? Well, let's test that theory. Next week, we're doing individual combat assessments. Each recruit will face multiple scenarios testing different aspects of combat readiness. We'll see how much those physical advantages really matter when everything is on the line." As the group dispersed, Sarah found herself surrounded by members of other squads who wanted to understand what had just happened. The dismissive attitudes and mocking comments that had characterized her first month of training were completely gone, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. "How did you know they would attack through that alley?" asked Jennifer Walsh, one of the top performers from another squad. "I watched their previous exercises," Sarah replied. "Brett always chooses the most direct approach. He's not comfortable with complicated maneuvers, so he tends to stick with simple, aggressive tactics." "But how did you coordinate everything so perfectly? Your timing was incredible." Sarah smiled. "Practice. My squad has been working together for weeks now. We know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we've learned to trust each other completely. That kind of team cohesion takes time to develop." What Sarah didn't say was that the real key to her success had been her ability to see the bigger picture. While Brett had been focused on the immediate tactical problem of attacking a defensive position, Sarah had been thinking several moves ahead, anticipating not just what Brett would do, but how he would react when his initial plan failed. That evening in the barracks, The conversation was dominated by discussion of the urban warfare exercise. Even recruits from other companies had heard about what happened, and Sarah found herself fielding questions from people who had previously ignored her existence. "So what's your secret, Chin?" asked Kevin Murphy, a recruit from another squad who had been particularly vocal in his early criticisms of Sarah's abilities. "Did you have military training before you enlisted?" "Nothing formal," Sarah replied. "My grandfather taught me some things about strategy and tactics, but mostly I just pay attention and try to learn from everything I observe." Jake, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. "The thing about Chun is that she doesn't just think about what she needs to do. She thinks about what everyone else needs to do and how it all fits together. It's like she can see the whole battle at once instead of just her part of it." The comment prompted nods of agreement from the other members of Sarah's squad. They had all noticed that her leadership style was different from anything they had experienced before. Instead of giving orders and expecting blind obedience, she explained her reasoning and made sure everyone understood their role in the larger plan. "Plus, she actually listens to us," Tommy added. "If someone has a better idea or spots something she missed, she's not too proud to change the plan. That's pretty rare." As the week progressed, word of Sarah's tactical victory continued to spread throughout the company and beyond. Drill sergeants from other units began stopping by to observe her squad's training exercises. Officers who had never paid attention to the recruits suddenly knew Sarah's name. But the attention also brought increased pressure. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see if the navigation exercise and urban warfare victory had been flukes or if Sarah really possessed the leadership abilities that her recent successes suggested. The individual combat assessments that Drill Sergeant Williams had announced would provide the ultimate test. These exercises would strip away the advantages of teamwork and force each recruit to succeed or fail based on their individual capabilities. For Sarah, who had built her reputation on her ability to maximize team effectiveness, the challenge would be proving that she could excel when operating alone. Brett Davidson was already spreading rumors that Sarah's recent successes had been dependent on her squad mates' abilities rather than her own skills. Take away her team, and she's just another small person trying to do a big person's job, he told anyone who would listen. The assessment would consist of 3 scenarios: close quarters combat, marksmanship under stress, and tactical decision-making in a crisis situation. Each recruit would face all 3 challenges individually, with their performance being evaluated by a panel of drill sergeants and officers. Sarah spent the week preparing intensively, practicing her combat techniques and studying tactical scenarios late into the night. She knew that this assessment would either cement her reputation as a legitimate leader or expose her as someone who had gotten lucky a few times. But as she lay in her bunk the night before the assessment, Sarah felt calm and confident. She had learned something important about herself over the past several weeks. Her greatest strength was not her physical abilities or even her tactical knowledge, but rather her capacity to adapt and improve under pressure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Sarah Chun was ready to face them. The girl who had been mocked for being too small and weak to be a soldier was about to prove that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one nobody saw coming. The morning of the individual combat assessments dawned gray and cold, with a steady drizzle that turned the training grounds into a muddy mess. Sarah stood in formation with the other 42 recruits who had made it this far through basic training, her heart steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. Drill Sergeant Williams addressed the assembled group with his usual stern expression. "Today, you will face 3 individual challenges designed to test your combat readiness under stress. These assessments will determine not only whether you graduate from basic training, but also your military occupational specialty and future assignments." He gestured toward a series of training areas that had been set up around the base. First challenge is close quarters combat. You'll face multiple opponents in confined spaces using simulated weapons. Second challenge is precision marksmanship under stress conditions. Third challenge is tactical decision-making in a crisis scenario with real-time consequences. William's eyes swept across the group. Performance will be evaluated by a panel of officers and senior non-commissioned officers. The top performers will be eligible for advanced training programs and leadership positions. The bottom performers. He let the implication hang in the air. Brett Davidson stood 2 rows behind Sarah, and she could feel his confident gaze boring into the back of her head. He had spent the past week telling anyone who would listen that the individual assessments would expose Sarah as a fraud who had been carried by her more capable squad mates. Chen's been lucky so far, he had said repeatedly, but luck runs out when you're standing alone. The first challenge took place in a specially constructed building designed to simulate urban combat conditions. Each recruit would enter alone and face a series of scenarios involving multiple opponents armed with paintball weapons. The objective was to neutralize the threats while minimizing damage to yourself and any simulated civilians in the environment. Sarah watched from the observation area as the early participants went through their attempts. Jake Morrison performed respectably, using his size and strength to overpower opponents through direct confrontation. Marcus Rodriguez showed excellent reflexes and street-smart tactical awareness, clearing rooms efficiently and aggressively. Brett Davidson's turn came early in the rotation, and his performance was impressive by conventional standards. He moved through the building like a force of nature, using overwhelming aggression to dominate each encounter. His approach was loud and direct but undeniably effective. When he emerged from the building, he was grinning with satisfaction. "Beat that time, Chun," he called out as he passed her in the observation area. When Sarah's name was called, she walked to the starting position with outward calm. The building loomed before her, its darkened windows and narrow doorways concealing unknown threats. She took a deep breath, centered herself the way her grandfather had taught her, and stepped inside. The first room appeared empty, but Sarah's training told her that appearances were deceiving. She moved slowly along the wall, staying low and keeping her weapon ready. The attack came from above, a defender hidden in the rafters who dropped down behind her, assuming she would be focused on the obvious hiding places at ground level. But Sarah had noticed the displaced ceiling tile during her initial scan of the room. As the attacker landed, she spun and put 2 paintball rounds center mass before he could bring his weapon to bear. The simulated civilian in the corner remained unharmed. Room by room, Sarah progressed through the building with methodical precision. Where other recruits had charged forward, she advanced carefully. Where they had relied on speed and aggression, she used patience and observation. Each threat was neutralized with minimal ammunition expenditure and maximum efficiency. The final scenario was the most challenging, a hostage situation in a room with multiple defenders and innocent civilians. Previous recruits had either failed to distinguish between threats and non-combatants or had been eliminated while trying to position themselves for clear shots. Sarah studied the room layout from the doorway for nearly 30 seconds before moving, identifying 3 defenders, 2 hostages, and multiple points of cover. Then she acted with sudden, decisive speed. Instead of entering through the obvious door, she circled around to a side window that other recruits had ignored. The defenders were positioned to cover the main entrance, but they had poor visibility on the alternate approach. Sarah's first shot eliminated the defender covering the hostages. Her second took out the sniper in the elevated position, and her third neutralized the final threat before he could react to the unexpected angle of attack. When she emerged from the building, the observers were talking among themselves in low, impressed tones. Her time was the second fastest recorded, but more importantly, she had achieved perfect scores on accuracy, tactical awareness, and civilian safety. The second challenge tested marksmanship skills under stress conditions. Recruits had to engage targets at various distances while dealing with distractions including loud noises, simulated explosions, and time pressure. The course was designed to simulate the chaos and pressure of actual combat conditions. Sarah's approach to this challenge was different from her performance in the building clearing exercise. Where she had been methodical and patient before, now she was focused and aggressive. Her grandfather had taught her that different situations required different mindsets, and marksmanship under stress called for a calm center combined with decisive action. The targets appeared and disappeared rapidly, requiring quick target acquisition and precise shot placement. Sarah's small size actually proved to be an advantage here, as she could quickly drop into stable shooting positions that larger recruits struggled to achieve. Her shots were consistent and accurate, even as simulated explosions went off around her and loudspeakers blared distracting noises. When the smoke cleared, Sarah had achieved the highest marksmanship score recorded that day. Brett Davidson, who had considered himself the best shooter in the company, found himself relegated to third place. His larger frame, which he had always considered an advantage, had made it difficult for him to adapt to the changing shooting positions required by the course. But it was the third challenge that would prove to be the most revealing test of each recruit's true potential. The tactical decision-making exercise presented each participant with a complex scenario involving multiple objectives, limited resources, and conflicting priorities. There were no right or wrong answers, only better and worse solutions based on the participants' ability to analyze the situation and make sound decisions under pressure. The scenario was this: a small military unit had been cut off from their main force during a combat operation. They had wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention, limited ammunition, and intelligence indicating that enemy reinforcements were approaching their position. The participant had to decide how to allocate resources, prioritize objectives, and develop a plan for either evacuation or defense. Brett Davidson's solution was characteristically direct. He chose to establish a defensive perimeter, distribute ammunition equally among all personnel, and prepare for a conventional firefight with the approaching enemy forces. His plan was sound from a tactical perspective, but failed to address the medical situation or consider alternative approaches. Other recruits offered variations on similar themes, most focused on the immediate military threat while treating the wounded soldiers and resource limitations as secondary concerns. Their solutions were competent but unimaginative, following conventional military doctrine without considering the unique aspects of the scenario. When Sarah's turn came, she approached the problem from a completely different angle. Instead of accepting the premise that a direct confrontation was inevitable, she looked for ways to avoid the fight entirely while still accomplishing the mission objectives. The primary objective is preserving the lives of our soldiers, she began, addressing the panel of evaluators. The wounded need immediate medical attention, which they won't get if we're engaged in a prolonged firefight. The approaching enemy force outnumbers us and has better equipment, so a defensive battle would likely result in heavy casualties even if we win. She pointed to the map display showing the scenario area. Instead of preparing for defense, I would split our forces into two groups. The smaller group, consisting of our most mobile personnel, would establish a diversionary position here, drawing the enemy's attention and making them believe we're preparing for a conventional defense. Sarah indicated different positions on the map as she continued her explanation. Meanwhile, the main group would evacuate the wounded along this route, which appears to be outside the enemy's expected approach path. The diversionary group would maintain contact just long enough to ensure the evacuation group reaches safety, then disengage using predetermined withdrawal routes. One of the evaluating officers leaned forward. What if the enemy doesn't take the bait? What if they ignore your diversionary force and pursue the evacuation group? Then we adapt, Sarah replied without hesitation. The diversionary force would break contact immediately and move to intercept the enemy along the evacuation route. The plan succeeds if the wounded reach safety, even if it means higher risk for the healthy soldiers. Another evaluator asked, how do you determine who goes with each group? How do you decide who faces the higher risk? Sarah's answer revealed the depth of her tactical thinking. The diversionary group consists of volunteers, led by the most experienced combat leader available. The evacuation group is led by the person with the best navigation and survival skills. Assignment is based on capabilities and mission requirements, not rank or seniority. The questioning continued for 20 minutes, with the evaluators probing every aspect of Sarah's plan and testing her ability to adapt to changing conditions. Each time they presented a new complication or challenged one of her assumptions, she demonstrated the flexibility and creativity that had characterized her previous successes. When the individual assessments were complete, all 43 recruits were assembled in the base auditorium for the results. Drill Sergeant Williams stood at the podium with a folder containing the evaluation scores, his expression giving nothing away. "Before I announce the results," Williams began, "I want to say something about what these assessments were designed to measure. We weren't just testing your physical abilities or your knowledge of military procedures. We were testing your ability to think under pressure, adapt to unexpected situations, and demonstrate the kind of judgment that separates competent soldiers from exceptional leaders." He opened the folder and began reading names and scores. The results were mixed, with some surprises and some confirmations of expectations. Jake Morrison scored well on physical challenges, but struggled with the tactical decision-making exercise. Marcus Rodriguez showed excellent combat instincts, but had difficulty with the precision marksmanship under stress. Brett Davidson's name was called with scores that placed him in the top 10% of the group. His performance had been impressive across all 3 challenges, and his satisfaction was evident as he stepped forward to receive his evaluation. But when Sarah's name was called, the auditorium fell silent. Her scores were not just in the top 10%. They were the highest recorded in all 3 categories. Moreover, her performance in the tactical decision-making exercise had been so exceptional that the evaluating panel had specifically noted it for further review. "Chun," Williams said, looking directly at her, "your tactical assessment has been forwarded to the Officer Candidate School Selection Board. You're being recommended for advanced leadership training." The reaction in the auditorium was immediate and intense. Some recruits applauded enthusiastically, particularly those from Sarah's squad who had witnessed her development firsthand. Others sat in stunned silence, struggling to reconcile this outcome with their preconceived notions about what a soldier should look like. Brett Davidson's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and, finally, grudging respect. The foundation of his worldview, built on the assumption that physical dominance translated directly to military effectiveness, had been shattered by a 5'4" woman who had consistently outperformed him through intelligence, preparation, and leadership ability. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by congratulations from her fellow recruits. Even those who had been most skeptical of her abilities were forced to acknowledge that her success had been earned through merit rather than luck. "I owe you an apology," said Kevin Murphy, the recruit who had been particularly vocal in his early criticisms. "I was wrong about you. Dead wrong." Tommy Parker, whose confidence had grown considerably under Sarah's leadership, grinned broadly. "I knew you were special from the navigation exercise. This just proves it to everyone else." But it was Jake Morrison's comment that meant the most to Sarah. The former football player who had initially dismissed her as a weakling walked up and extended his hand. "Chun, I want you to know that serving under your command has been an honor. You've taught me more about real leadership in 3 months than I learned in 4 years of playing sports." Brett Davidson was among the last to approach her. His pride was clearly wounded, but his respect was genuine. "I don't understand how you do it," he said quietly. "I've been bigger and stronger than everyone else my whole life. That's always been enough before." Sarah looked at him with understanding rather than triumph. "Being bigger and stronger is an advantage," she said. "But it's only one tool in the toolbox. The key is figuring out which tool to use for each job." She gestured toward their assembled classmates. "Look around this room. Every person here has something they're best at. Jake's physical courage, Tommy's determination, Marcus's street smarts, your natural aggressiveness. They're all valuable in the right situation. Good leadership is about recognizing those strengths and putting people in positions where they can use them most effectively. Brett nodded slowly, beginning to understand something that had eluded him throughout his entire athletic career. So, it's not about being the strongest or the fastest or the loudest. It's about being the smartest about how to use what you've got. Exactly, Sarah replied. And sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest impact, not despite their size, but because of how they've learned to compensate for it. As the group began to disperse, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 months ago, she had stepped off a bus as the most underestimated recruit in the company. She had endured mockery, skepticism, and outright dismissal from people who couldn't see past her physical appearance to recognize her potential. But she had also discovered something important about herself, that her grandfather's lessons about strategy, patience, and leadership had prepared her for challenges she had never imagined. The girl who had been too small to play sports, too quiet to be noticed, and too different to fit in had found her calling in a place where none of those limitations mattered. 6 months later, Second Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood before her first command, a platoon of infantry soldiers preparing for deployment to a combat zone. Her soldiers were mostly bigger, older, and more experienced than she was, and she could see the familiar skepticism in their eyes as they sized up their new commanding officer. "I know what you're thinking," she said, addressing the assembled platoon with quiet confidence. "You're wondering how someone who looks like me could possibly lead soldiers like you into combat." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. 3 months from now, when we're downrange facing real threats and making life or death decisions, you won't care how tall I am or how much I can bench press. You'll care about whether I can keep you alive and help you accomplish the mission. Sarah looked each of her soldiers in the eye as she spoke. "I'm here to tell you that I can and will do both. Not because I'm the strongest or the fastest or the loudest, but because I've learned something that many people never figure out, that true strength comes from bringing out the best in everyone around you." The platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of experience, stepped forward. "Ma'am, what are your orders?" Sarah smiled, remembering a similar moment during her first week of basic training when Jake Morrison had asked the same question. The difference was that now she knew exactly what to say. "First, we're going to learn everything we can about each other's strengths and weaknesses. Then, we're going to train together until we function as a single unit. And finally, we're going to deploy as the most prepared, most cohesive, and most effective platoon this unit has ever fielded." She gestured toward the training area where they would spend the next several weeks preparing for deployment. "By the time we're finished, you'll understand why the people who used to mock the new recruit ended up following her into combat." As her platoon moved out to begin their first training exercise under her command, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from that first morning at Fort Harrison. The girl who had been dismissed as too small and weak to be a soldier had become an officer whose reputation for tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership preceded her wherever she went. But more importantly, she had proven something that her grandfather had tried to teach her years ago, that real strength didn't come from physical dominance or loud voices or intimidating presences. It came from understanding people, developing their potential, and creating teams that were greater than the sum of their parts. The recruit they had mocked had indeed taken command over them all, not through force or manipulation, but through the simple demonstration that leadership was about service, not domination. And in doing so, she had changed not only her own life, but the lives of everyone who had the privilege of serving under her command. 3 years later, Captain Sarah Chun would lead that same platoon through a deployment that would earn them a Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. But that's another story for another time. This story ends where it began, with a young woman who refused to be defined by other people's limitations and who proved that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody sees coming.